Continuing. Prejudice is bad. That's one of our prejudices. Prejudice in the form of bigotry. Prejudice in the form of prejudging situations so that we think we understand them, can make educated guesses. That's not only good, necessary, it's good. But race prejudice, bigotry, bad. There's another thing that affects public opinion. People look out for their own self-interest. My brother-in-law, who's a Vietnam-era veteran, is conservative, differently than I, but still basically conservative, which means that he believes in cutting taxes and cutting government spending in general terms. He also believes, like I do, in a simplified tax code, where basically people pay a predictable amount, a percentage of their income, if we're going to have an income tax, with very few deductions at a low rate. But when we were talking about this several years ago, it became clear that the exception to this was the homeowners deduction that a person gets on their income tax. When a person owns a home, the taxes collected by the federal government that relate to the expenses of owning a home, paying a mortgage, and so forth are largely forgiven, and that money is part of your tax return, which is quite important to homeowners. It's a way of them being able to afford property. Real estate, remember we talked about that. So he wanted to get rid of deductions, but not his house deduction, not his homeowner's deduction. That's self-interest. Here's another example. If a person is of military age and they're worried about being drafted into a major war, and we haven't had the draft since the early 1970s, but if we get involved in a major war with a land power in Europe or Asia, the chances are that a volunteer army probably won't cut it. So if you're of military age and you're concerned about that, you might be very careful to vote for candidates that are not going to casually get us involved in a shooting war that you may be drafted to fight. That's self-interest. If you are a very religious person and you believe in certain things that may not be politically correct, you might vote for candidates that, for example, oppose abortion on demand or oppose a healthcare system that requires taxpayers to pay for services that you don't believe in. Or if you are a recipient of federal aid, you might not vote for a candidate who is liable to cut that federal aid. You might be voting instead for people who are going to expand it. In other words, most people take into account their own self-interests and they vote accordingly. Education. There is a prejudice that many people seem to have about the way education affects votes. The more educational attainment a person has in our modern day, the more liberal they tend to be. Well, it is true. Most college professors are extremely progressive, liberal, socialist, or even communist. Just ask them. They'll tell you. This is not me making it up. If you look at most high school educators, there's still a vast majority of liberals and progressives and a few socialists and communists. Not that many conservatives or libertarians. If you look at people who have advanced degrees beyond bachelor's degree, they're more likely to be liberal. Why is this? Well, what a liberal or progressive would say is, if you're smart, you're a liberal. If you're educated and you understand the world, you're going to be more progressive, which is a self-serving argument. It's kind of silly, actually. So, yeah, the smart people, they're on my side. Only the stupid people, they are those other kinds. No. Life's not that simple. It's not as simple as people who agree with me are good. People who disagree with me are bad. That's the first step towards fanaticism. In fact, education does affect whether or not a person is going to tend to be liberal or conservative. But it's not simply a math equation, more knowledge, more education, more training equals more liberal, because liberalism is smarter. The education system, at least since the 1940s and 50s, has tended to attract and keep more liberal people. Curricula, which is the body of knowledge that teachers teach, tends to become more and more liberal as the 50s become the 60s, has become the 70s, 80s, 90s, and so forth. College campuses become less and less places where people can go to discuss and exchange ideas in a polite way, to the extent that today you have college campuses, almost all of them, that have free speech zones, because you don't have free speech everywhere else. Where if you express an idea that is different from the politically correct norm, you might be punished by professors, by the administration, or by other students with the blessing of professors or the administration. So it makes sense that this phenomenon of the more educated you are, the more liberal or progressive you tend to be, even socialist or communist, has something to do with the way that education has changed since the 1950s, since World War II, basically in 1945. It also has something to do with the way educated people tend to analyze problems. Educated people tend to use a lot of logic, and they tend to use systems of logic that they learn as part of their various trainings. However, I can tell you, as somebody who lived in the Bronx and had some contact with the streets, the world is not logical. There's book smarts and there's street smarts. There's knowing something in theory and there's doing something in reality. And the gulf between theoretical knowledge, which tends to be rational, logical, elegant, and sensible within its own system, often has very little to do with the realities in the field and on the ground as people are actually living their lives and going through the challenges that that involves. So, will a person's education level affect this? Yes, because a person who is willing to devote the time, energy, and money necessary to get a master's degree or a PhD is going to tend to value the kind of theoretical knowledge that universities specialize in. Whereas a person who has more interest in surviving in the practical, non-academic world outside of the ivory tower might be less willing to devote those years of time and those tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars of money to get those degrees. Also, they may be in a business that doesn't require them. So education is one of the factors that affects. And the media. We'll get to that next time.